Courtrooms in small American towns rarely draw much attention. Most days, hearings involve minor disputes, routine motions, or the occasional traffic case. But on this particular morning, the courthouse in Meadowbrook, a town known more for its harvest festivals than its legal dramas, was packed to the brim. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation, as if everyone knew that something unusual, maybe even historic, was about to unfold. At the heart of the case was Daniel Harris, a 32-year-old local man accused of breaking into the Ramirez family's home. On paper, the trial seemed straightforward. A burglary charge, no injuries, a few pieces of missing jewelry, and property damage. But what set this trial apart wasn't the crime itself. It was the strange, almost unbelievable twist that involved the youngest witness ever to set foot in that courthouse. The townspeople filed in early, whispering rumors as they took their seats on the polished wooden benches. Housewives sat beside shopkeepers, retirees beside college students on break, all craning their necks to see the defendant and his legal team. Some came because they knew the Ramirez family personally. Others were drawn purely by curiosity. News had spread like wildfire that the Ramirez's 3-year-old daughter, Emily, was going to play some role in the proceedings. 3 years old, one man muttered to his neighbor. Barely old enough to form a full sentence. What could she possibly know? I don't know, a neighbor replied. But they say she hasn't stopped repeating the same words. Since that night, gives me chills just thinking about it. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his spectacles and scanned the restless audience. He was a seasoned figure, known for his no-nonsense approach. In his decades on the bench, he had presided over serious trials, armed robbery, drug cases, even a rare homicide, but never had a child so young been mentioned as potentially influencing the course of justice. He didn't like the spectacle, yet he couldn't deny the significance it carried for the jury, who looked equally curious and uneasy. The prosecution's table was stacked with files, photographs, and evidence bags, but Assistant District Attorney Claire Morton knew all too well that her case was weak. There were no reliable fingerprints, no DNA, and no clear video footage. Harris's shoes roughly matched prints found in the Ramirez yard, but they were common enough that a defense lawyer could easily cast doubt. For weeks, she had worried the case might collapse. But then the Ramirez family had shared a detail. That changed everything. Their toddler daughter's odd and persistent words whenever she saw the police K-9 that helped with the investigation. Morton glanced toward the jury box, trying to read their expressions. They looked ordinary enough teachers. Retirees, a young mechanic, a librarian, but she knew they were already caught up in the drama of the story spreading around town. The weight of her case rested not on forensic breakthroughs, but on whether she could convince them that a child's innocent voice revealed something that adults had overlooked. At the defense table, Harris sat with his attorney, Mark Jennings, a sharp-suited lawyer from the city who had taken the case at Harris's insistence. Jennings leaned in, speaking in low tones, his confidence unshaken. He had already filed objections to the very idea of bringing Emily into court, calling it a dangerous ploy to manipulate the jury's emotions. Children are impressionable, he reminded the judge. She's 3 years old. She can barely distinguish fantasy from reality. This is theater, not evidence. But the murmurs in the crowd told a different story. People didn't come to watch technical legal arguments. They came because something about the image of a toddler pointing at a police dog and uttering 2 chilling words, "Bad man," had captured their imaginations. It was the kind of detail that spread fast in a town where gossip traveled quicker than official reports. The Ramirez family sat quietly in the second row, their faces pale but composed. Mr. Ramirez kept one arm around his wife, while little Emily, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, doodled on a notepad with crayons her mother had brought to keep her busy. To the jurors, she looked like any other cheerful child pigtails, pink dress, and bright eyes that lit up when she scribbled a star on her paper. And yet, those same eyes, according to her parents, had stared into the dark on the night of the burglary and seen something she would never forget. As the clock ticked toward the start of proceedings, the atmosphere thickened. Reporters from nearby towns set up their notepads, some even whispering about how the case was attracting regional media attention. "A child's words shake a courtroom." That was the headline already forming in their minds. Judge Whitmore finally cleared his throat and called the room to order, his gavel echoing against the paneled walls. "This is the matter of State versus Daniel Harris," he announced. "We will proceed with opening statements." His voice was steady, but even he couldn't help noticing how the jurors leaned forward in their seats, their focus sharper than usual. Morton rose first, buttoning her suit jacket. She spoke of the Ramirez family's fear, of the intruder's violation of their home, and of the circumstantial evidence pointing to Harris. But what truly held the jury's attention was her final remark. "Ladies and gentlemen, in this case, you will hear something rare. You will hear the voice of innocence itself. And though it comes from someone very small, I believe it will speak louder than any piece of evidence we've seen so far." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jennings immediately rose to object, but the judge waved him down, reminding everyone that the jury alone would decide what weight, if any, to give such a demonstration. And so, before a single witness had taken the stand, the trial was already unlike any other. The people of Meadowbrook, who had expected another routine burglary case, found themselves at the edge of their seats. They weren't just waiting to see if Harris was guilty. They were waiting to hear if a child, barely out of infancy, could truly shake the foundations of a courtroom. In that moment, the town understood this was no longer just a trial. It was a story, one that would be told and retold, about how justice, truth, and innocence collided in the most unexpected of voices. The Ramirez family had always thought of their home as a sanctuary. Nestled at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac in Meadowbrook, their modest two-story house was filled with the sounds of laughter, family dinners, and the endless chatter of a 3-year-old. For Miguel and Rosa Ramirez, life had been stable, predictable, even comforting. That all changed on a humid summer night, when a single event shattered the illusion of safety they had always taken for granted. It began just past midnight. Rosa had stirred awake when she thought she heard something. Downstairs, perhaps, a bump against the kitchen counter or the soft creak of the back door. At first, she dismissed it as the house settling, but then she noticed something chilling. A faint beam of light moving across the hallway wall. Someone was inside. Miguel, groggy but alert, grabbed a flashlight and whispered for Rosa to stay put. Their daughter Emily, only 3, was still awake in her room, sitting on her bed with her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. She had always been a light sleeper, and on this night, her big brown eyes were wide open, as though she sensed something was very wrong. Before Miguel could make it to the stairs, they heard a noise that erased any doubt, the distinct sound of glass crunching underfoot. Whoever was in their home wasn't supposed to be there. Rosa dialed 911 with shaking hands while Miguel locked their bedroom door. Within minutes, police sirens wailed in the distance, but the damage had already been done. The intruder had fled through the broken back window, leaving chaos in his wake. Drawers had been pulled open, jewelry boxes overturned, and several family heirlooms, including Rosa's grandmother's necklace, were missing. But the loss of property wasn't what hurt the most. It was the feeling of being violated, of knowing that a stranger had moved through their home while their child slept. Or rather, while their child was supposed to be asleep. When officers questioned them that night, Rosa realized something unusual. Emily wasn't just awake, she had been watching. The little girl sat on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the doorway as if expecting someone to return. When an officer knelt down and asked gently if she saw anything, Emily nodded. She didn't say much, her vocabulary was still limited, but she whispered words that didn't make sense at the time. Bad man. The officer exchanged a look with his partner, then smiled kindly and told Rosa not to worry. Children often repeated what they heard adults say. But Rosa knew these weren't borrowed words. There was something about the way Emily said them, quietly, firmly, almost as though she were pointing at an invisible shadow, that unsettled her. Over the following days, the Ramirez family struggled to return to normal life. Miguel reinforced the doors and replaced the shattered glass. Rosa stayed up late, double-checking every lock. Emily, though, seemed fixated on the incident in her own way. Each time police officers visited, bringing their canine unit to sniff for evidence, Emily reacted strangely. She wouldn't hide from the large German shepherd, nor would she try to play with it like most children might. Instead, she would point at the dog and repeat the same phrase, "Bad man?" At first, Rosa tried to hush her, embarrassed. "She's just a toddler," she explained to the officers. "She doesn't understand what she's saying." But Emily persisted. Every visit, every time the dog appeared, the words came back. Sometimes she whispered them. Sometimes she said them loudly, with conviction that belied her age. Always the same two words. Neighbors began to notice too. One afternoon, when the canine officer stopped by again, Mrs. Donnelly from across the street saw Emily's reaction and told Rosa she had goosebumps. "That child knows something," she whispered. "You can see it in her eyes. Children don't lie about things like that. Not that seriously." The Ramirez parents didn't know what to make of it. On one hand, they wanted to shield Emily from the trauma. On the other, they couldn't ignore the possibility that she had witnessed something crucial. Late at night, after Emily finally drifted to sleep, Rosa and Miguel would sit at the kitchen table, whispering their fears. "What if she really saw his face?" Miguel asked one evening. "And what if she remembers?" Rosa replied, her voice trembling. "She's so young. What if testifying scars her for life?" They both knew their daughter's innocence was at stake, yet so was justice. The stolen heirlooms could be replaced, but the violation of their home demanded accountability. Weeks passed, and the police investigation turned up a suspect. Daniel Harris, a man with a record of petty thefts and burglaries in neighboring towns. He lived only a few miles away, and circumstantial evidence tied him loosely to the crime. But nothing definitive emerged. His alibi was shaky, but not impossible. His shoe size matched the prints outside the Ramirez home, but dozens of people in Meadowbrook wore the same brand. The case, as the prosecutor would later admit, was dangerously thin. It was Emily who kept the case alive. Officers couldn't ignore her repeated words, nor the way she seemed to react specifically to Harris's photograph when shown during routine checks. One day, while the canine unit was present, an officer casually flipped through pictures of known offenders. Emily, sitting on Rosa's lap, pointed to Harris's photo without hesitation. "Bad man," she said, in the same tone she always used. The room fell silent. From that moment on, Emily became central to the case, though not in a traditional sense. The prosecutors knew they couldn't legally treat her as a formal witness. She was too young to swear an oath or undergo cross-examination. But her consistent reaction carried weight, if not in the strict rules of evidence, then certainly in the court of human impression. For the Ramirez family, the ordeal was twofold. They were still grappling with their own fear-jumping at creeks. In the night, locking every door twice, keeping Emily close wherever they went. At the same time, they felt the pressure of a looming trial in which their daughter's words might tip the scales. Rosa struggled with guilt. What if they put too much on her shoulders? She confided to her sister. She's only 3. She should be thinking about dolls and picture books, not bad men. Yet Emily remained unfazed. Children her age lived in the moment, and to her, bad man was simply the truth as she understood it. She didn't know about trials, evidence, or verdicts. She only knew what she had seen and what she remembered. In her small world, the words weren't heavy, they were just facts. As the trial approached, the Ramirez family grew both anxious and determined. They sat through meetings with lawyers, answered reporters' questions with polite refusals, and did their best to shield Emily from the growing attention. But deep down, they knew their ordeal wasn't over. The burglary had begun as a crime of broken glass and missing jewels. Now it had become something bigger, a story about innocence, memory, and the haunting certainty of a child's voice. And for the Ramirez family, the ordeal wasn't just about proving who had broken into their home. It was about reclaiming their peace, their trust in safety, and their belief that justice, no matter how fragile, could still be found. The trial of Daniel Harris was already shaping up to be one of the most unusual cases Meadowbrook had ever seen. But nothing could have prepared the jury for the moment when the prosecution introduced a new, unconventional element, the words of a 3-year-old child. From the start, Assistant District Attorney Claire Morton had known her case was precarious. The burglary at the Ramirez home had shaken the family deeply, but evidence was thin. A footprint in the mud, some vague witness accounts of a man seen walking near the cul-de-sac, and Harris's history of theft, none of it was strong enough to guarantee a conviction. The defense had seized on these weaknesses, and Morton feared the trial might collapse into acquittal. But then there was Emily. Morton hesitated for weeks before deciding to bring Emily's peculiar consistency into the trial. The girl wasn't being called as a formal witness. She was far too young for that, but the prosecution believed her repeated words. Bad man carried weight as a demonstration. The judge had reluctantly agreed, though he reminded the jury they must rely on hard evidence, not sentiment. Still, Morton knew that the human heart wasn't so easily separated from the human mind. In the days leading up to trial, she went over the moment again and again in her head. She thought about how Emily, sitting on her mother's lap, had pointed to the K9 and then to Harris's photo with unwavering certainty. Morton had seen hardened detectives falter when recounting violent crimes, but Emily never wavered. That was the part that made it so powerful. The defense attorney, Mark Jennings, had argued furiously against it. "Your Honor, this is theater," he declared during pre-trial motions. "We cannot allow a toddler's vague impressions to sway a jury. Children this age are suggestible, unreliable, and entirely incapable of distinguishing reality from imagination. The danger of prejudice is enormous." Judge Whitmore considered the objection carefully. Finally, he ruled, "The child will not be considered a sworn witness. Her words cannot be taken as testimony. However, the prosecution may present her reaction as part of their narrative, with the jury left to determine its significance." Jennings was furious. "So, we're allowing superstition to replace evidence?" "Mr. Jennings," the judge said firmly, "we're allowing the jury to observe, nothing more." And so, the stage was set for one of the strangest courtroom moments in town history. On the morning Emily was scheduled to appear, the atmosphere in the courthouse was electric. The jury filed into their seats, curious and wary. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, preparing for the headline they knew was coming. Even seasoned police officers, accustomed to the dry routine of court testimony, leaned forward to watch. The Ramirez family entered quietly. Rosa carried Emily in her arms, the little girl clutching her stuffed rabbit. She wore a simple pink dress with white shoes, her hair tied in pigtails. To most of the jurors, she looked like any child they might see at a playground or Sunday school. Nothing about her appearance suggested she could play a role in something as serious as a felony trial. Morton approached the bench, her voice calm but steady. "Your Honor, with your permission, we'd like to present Emily Ramirez to the court." Again, not as a sworn witness, but to demonstrate her consistent response since the night of the incident. Jennings rose immediately. "Objection. Noted," the judge interrupted. "Overruled. Proceed, Miss Morton, but I remind the jury once more, this is not testimony. You must evaluate its significance carefully." The room grew quiet as Rosa sat with Emily on the witness stand. The child swung her legs nervously, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Rosa whispered something reassuring in her ear. Morton nodded to the bailiff, who opened the side door. In walked Officer Bradley with his canine partner, Rex, a large German shepherd trained in search and detection. Rex's nails clicked softly against the courtroom floor as he padded forward, calm and obedient by his handler's side. All eyes shifted to Emily. For a few seconds, she simply stared, wide-eyed but not afraid. Then, slowly, she raised her tiny hand and pointed not at the dog, but across the room. Her finger landed on Daniel Harris. The room tensed. Harris, seated at the defense table, shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Emily turned back to Rex, then pointed again at Harris. In a small, clear voice, she said the words everyone had been waiting for. "Bad man," gasps filled the courtroom. Some jurors' jaws dropped. A reporter's pen scratched frantically across a notepad. Rosa held her daughter tighter, but Emily remained calm, as though she had simply stated an obvious fact. Jennings shot to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, this is precisely what I warned about pure emotional manipulation." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Jennings, sit down. The jury has been instructed on the limits of this demonstration." But the damage was done. The sight of a child, innocent and uncoached, pointing at the defendant and speaking with such conviction, had landed with seismic force. No amount of legal caution could erase the image from the jurors' minds. Morton kept her expression neutral, though inside she felt a wave of relief. She hadn't needed to coach Emily, hadn't needed to prompt her at all. The little girl had spoken with the same quiet certainty she had shown at home. And in that moment, the jury had felt it too. Jennings, realizing the gravity of what had just occurred, tried to regroup. He cross-examined Rosa, pressing her on whether Emily might have overheard adults calling Harris a bad man. "Children repeat what they hear," he insisted. "Isn't it true your daughter could have been influenced?" Rosa shook her head firmly. "She said it the very first night, before we even knew who the suspect was. She's never changed her words." Jennings tried another angle, questioning whether Emily might simply be frightened by the dog or the courtroom itself. But his arguments fell flat. The jurors had seen Emily's calm demeanor. She wasn't afraid, she was certain. By the time Emily and Rosa were excused, the courtroom still buzzed with tension. The judge called for a recess, perhaps recognizing that everyone needed time to process what had just happened. In the hallway outside, reporters swarmed, whispering about the extraordinary moment. Toddler points at defendant calls him bad man in open court. It was a headline ready-made for sensational news coverage. Back inside, Harris glared at the table in front of him, his jaw tight. He leaned toward Jennings and hissed something too quiet for others to hear. Jennings, visibly rattled for the first time, rubbed his temples and muttered back. The jurors, meanwhile, filed out silently, each of them carrying the image of the little girl pointing her finger with unwavering certainty. They had been told not to let emotion sway them, but the moment had branded itself in their memories. Morton, gathering her files, allowed herself a rare moment of hope. She knew the trial was far from over. Evidence still had to be weighed. Arguments still had to be made. But Emily's unexpected words had shifted the tide. What had once been a case balanced on the edge of doubt now leaned heavily toward belief. In the end, the law would remind the jury to focus on facts. Yet deep down, everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. Sometimes the simplest words from the smallest voices carried more weight than any forensic report. And Emily's words, "bad man," had just altered the course of the trial. Memory is a strange thing, fragile and fleeting in adults, even more so in children. Psychologists often debate how much a 3-year-old can truly recall and whether their words can be trusted as fact. But in Meadowbrook, no one needed a textbook to know that Emily Ramirez's memory was both persistent and unerringly precise. After the burglary, her parents expected the nightmare to fade. Children, they told themselves, had short attention spans. Emily would forget. She would go back to her dolls, cartoons, and bedtime stories. But she didn't forget. Instead, her memory condensed into 2 simple words. "Bad man," repeated with such consistency that it startled everyone around her. From the very first night, when the intruder had slipped away into the dark, Emily had whispered those words. At first, Rosa thought her daughter was simply parroting what an officer had said. But Rosa soon realized Emily hadn't heard anyone else use that phrase. It was her own description, her own judgment, spoken with unsettling conviction for someone so young. As days turned into weeks, the words never faded. When the police dog Rex visited their home, Emily would stiffen, point at him, and then at the doorway, repeating, "bad man." It was as though the dog reminded her of something about the intruder, something only she had noticed. Miguel tried to reason it away. "She's just associating the dog with the night," he said. "Maybe she remembers the flashing lights, the noise. Maybe that's all." But Rosa wasn't so sure. She had watched her daughter's eyes when she spoke. They weren't dreamy or confused. They were steady, almost too steady for a child. The persistence of Emily's memory unsettled the detectives as well. During follow-up visits, one officer asked gently, "Emily, can you tell me what you saw?" Emily just pointed at the dog and repeated the phrase. Nothing more, nothing less. "She won't give details," the officer told Rosa afterward, "but the consistency is what gets me. Kids this age usually change their story, add imaginary parts, or forget completely. She hasn't." The Ramirez family's friends and neighbors grew curious too. Word spread that Emily was the only one who had truly seen the intruder, and people began to treat her differently. At church, elderly parishioners bent down to ask her questions she couldn't fully answer. At the grocery store, neighbors whispered as Rosa pushed the cart with Emily sitting in the child's seat, quietly humming to herself. Everyone seemed fascinated by her memory, as though she were carrying a secret larger than herself. One afternoon, Rosa's sister Elena came to visit. Sitting at the kitchen table, she watched Emily play with blocks on the floor. Without warning, Emily stacked 2 blocks on top of each other, then turned to the door and said, "Bad man," before returning to her play. Elena shivered. "She's not making this up," Elena whispered. "It's like it's stamped on her mind." But with each repetition, Rosa's unease grew. She wondered what exactly Emily had seen. Was it just a face? A shadow? Something more sinister? Rosa wanted to ask, but every time she looked at her daughter's innocent expression, she stopped. Herself, some truths, she feared, were too heavy for such a small child to carry. The prosecution seized on Emily's memory as both a gift and a burden. Claire Morton, the prosecutor, met with the Ramirez family to discuss whether Emily could be brought into court, not to testify formally, but to show her consistency. She's only 3, Rosa protested. She doesn't understand courtrooms. She doesn't even understand what a jury is. Morton nodded sympathetically. I know, and I promise, we won't ask her to testify. But what she remembers, it matters. Sometimes innocence is the clearest lens we have. Miguel frowned. What if it harms her? What if being in that courtroom scares her? Morton hesitated before answering. It might. But it might also be the only way to stop him. If Harris walks free, what's to stop him from breaking into another home? From traumatizing another child? It was an impossible choice for the Meese. Parents, protect their daughter's innocence or allow her memory to be used to secure justice. In the end, it wasn't Rosa or Miguel who decided. It was Emily herself. On the morning of one of the pre-trial hearings, she overheard her parents whispering about the bad man. She looked up from her coloring book and said, as casually as if she were announcing she was hungry, I'll tell them. Her parents froze. Tell them what, Carrico? Rosa asked softly. Emily looked at her mother with wide, serious eyes. Bad man. I'll tell them. That was when Rosa realized her daughter wasn't afraid. She wasn't confused. She was certain. When the day came for Emily to appear in court, her memory played out exactly as it had at home. She pointed to Harris, then to Rex, the police dog, and spoke the words she had carried for weeks. Bad man. Her parents had braced for hesitation, for shyness, for the possibility that stage fright might erase everything. But Emily didn't falter. The jurors' reactions confirmed what Rosa had known all along. Emily's memory carried more force than any expert testimony. Some leaned forward, gripping the edge of their seats. Others looked down, clearly shaken. They had been warned by the judge not to place undue weight on her words, but the human heart doesn't always listen to instructions. What made it so powerful wasn't just the words themselves, it was the persistence of them. Dozens of times, in different settings, Emily had said the same phrase. She never embellished, never contradicted herself, never added detail. Adults might change their stories under pressure, but Emily's memory remained pure, untouched by doubt or interpretation. For Rosa and Miguel, it was bittersweet. They were proud of their daughter's courage, but they also worried about what it meant for her future. Would this memory fade as she grew older? Or would it haunt her? Would she one day look back and realize she had been part of something that changed the course of a man's life? That night, after the courtroom demonstration, Rosa tucked Emily into bed and asked gently, "Do you still think about the bad man?" Emily hugged her stuffed rabbit tightly. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but the dog will keep him away." Rosa kissed her forehead, fighting back tears. Out of all the people involved in the trial, the lawyers, the judge, the jury, it was Emily who seemed to hold the most faith that justice would be served. Her memory wasn't a burden to her. It was a beacon. And as Rosa turned off the light, she realized something. Adults often complicated truth with doubt, fear, and endless analysis. But sometimes, truth lived in the simplest of words, repeated by a child who refused to forget. Bad man. 2 words, 1 memory. And the unshakable certainty of a little girl who had seen more than she should have, yet remembered exactly what mattered. Courtrooms are places of ritual measured voices, rehearsed arguments, precise rules. But on the morning Emily Ramirez was brought into Meadowbrook's courthouse, ritual gave way to raw anticipation. Everyone sensed that something unforgettable was about to unfold. The gallery was full long before the bailiff called the room to order. Reporters lined the back benches, their pens poised. Neighbors from the Ramirez family street sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering nervously. Even off-duty police officers slipped inside to see for themselves. Rarely did a small-town burglary trial draw such a crowd, But this was no ordinary case. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when a 3-year-old child, barely out of toddlerhood, might sway the fate of a grown man. Judge Harold Whitmore entered, his black robe swishing as he settled behind the bench. Though known for his stern demeanor, he couldn't disguise the unease on his face. He had permitted the demonstration, reluctantly, reminding both sides and especially the jury that a child's unsworn words could not be treated as evidence. Still, he understood the power of perception. And perception, he knew, could change everything. The jurors filed in, 12 ordinary townspeople suddenly elevated to the most critical role in the room. They had listened patiently to the prosecutions. Evidence so far muddy shoe prints, a shaky alibi, the Ramirez family's testimony, but none of it had carried the emotional weight the prosecutors needed. They were curious now, almost anxious. Could a little girl really tell them something they didn't already know? Assistant District Attorney Claire Morton rose from her chair, smoothing her navy suit. She knew this was her gamble. If Emily froze or refused to speak, the defense would pounce, accusing her of exploiting a child for sympathy. But if Emily did what she had always done, if she spoke those 2 words with the same steady certainty, then the case could turn. "Your Honor," Morton began, her voice measured but firm, "with the court's permission, we would like to call Emily Ramirez to the stand." Again, not as a sworn witness, but as a demonstration of her consistent response since the incident. Defense attorney Mark Jennings shot to his feet. "Objection." His tone carried more desperation than confidence. "We're about to turn a felony trial into a puppet show. This child cannot be cross-examined, cannot be held to the truth, and yet the prosecution expects the jury to be swayed by her words. It's outrageous." Judge Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Jennings, your objection is noted. As I've already ruled, this demonstration is permissible, provided the jury understands its limitations. Proceed, Ms. Morton." Jennings sank back into his seat, muttering to his client, Daniel Harris, who scowled at the table in front of him. Harris's shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched. He knew eyes were already on him, waiting to see how he would react when confronted by a child's words. The bailiff opened the side door, and Rosa Ramirez entered, carrying Emily in her arms. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit, her small pink dress wrinkled from being held close. She looked around the courtroom with wide eyes, more curious than afraid, as though she were stepping into a storybook rather than a place where justice was decided. The room fell silent. Rosa settled into the witness chair with Emily on her lap. Morton smiled gently at the child. "Good morning, Emily." Emily looked at her, then at the judge, then at the rows of strangers staring back. She didn't speak, but her hand tightened around her rabbit. Morton nodded to the bailiff. "Your Honor, may Officer Bradley and his canine partner enter?" The judge gestured his assent. A side door opened again, and Officer Bradley walked in with Rex, the German shepherd. The dog's nails clicked against the wooden floor, his presence commanding yet calm. Rex sat obediently beside his handler, scanning the room with dark, intelligent eyes. Emily's gaze fixed on him instantly. Her body tensed not in fear, but in recognition. She pointed at Rex, then turned her small finger toward the defense table, straight at Daniel Harris. A ripple of energy passed through the room. The jurors leaned forward. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. Emily's voice came, soft but clear, carrying across the hushed courtroom. "Bad man." The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing louder than any lawyer's speech could. Gasps erupted from the gallery. One juror covered her mouth. Another shifted uncomfortably, as though the weight of the moment pressed on his shoulders. Even Judge Whitmore, who prided himself on impartiality, leaned back in his chair with a faint frown. Struck by the simplicity of the declaration, Jennings shot to his feet again. "Objection! Objection, Your Honor. This is prejudicial beyond measure. She's a child. She doesn't understand what she's saying." But the damage was done. The jury had seen Emily's unwavering finger, had heard her uncoached words, and had watched the defendant stiffen under her gaze. No ruling could erase the impression. "Sit down, Mr. Jennings," the judge said firmly. "The jury will recall my instructions. This is not sworn testimony. They must decide its significance themselves." Jennings obeyed, but his face burned with frustration. He leaned toward Harris, whispering urgently. Harris, meanwhile, stared at Emily with a mixture of disbelief and anger, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Rosa kissed the top of her daughter's head, whispering softly, "It's all right, mi amor." Emily seemed unfazed. To her, she had simply spoken the truth, as she always had. There was no drama in her tone, no hesitation in her gesture, just certainty. Morton, sensing the moment was complete, said quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez." "Thank you, Emily." She returned to her seat, hiding the swell of relief that threatened to show on her face. The judge called for a recess, perhaps recognizing that the room needed time to breathe. The jurors filed out silently, each carrying the image of the child pointing at the defendant. In the gallery, whispers rose like a tide. "Did you hear how she said it? She didn't even blink. That poor little girl, imagine what she saw that night." Out in the hallway, reporters hurried to phone in their updates. Headlines formed instantly. Toddler points at defendant, calls him bad man in courtroom drama. Inside, the defense table was tense. Jennings rubbed his temples, already preparing his strategy for damage control. "They're going to remember this," he muttered to Harris. "We have to hammer the jury with the unreliability of children. It's our only chance." But deep down, both men knew the truth. No matter how many times Jennings argued about suggestibility and memory, he couldn't erase the sound of a child's voice calling Harris the bad man. The words had branded themselves into the trial. As Rosa carried Emily out of the courtroom, the little girl looked back once, her expression calm. She had said what she came to say. To her, it was simple. She had seen a bad man, and now everyone else knew it too. And in that single moment, 3 quiet syllables had shifted the balance of the entire case. The moment Emily Ramirez's voice cut through the courtroom, time seemed to fracture. The word objection still echoed from the defense attorney's mouth, but no one truly heard it. All attention was locked on the tiny girl with pigtails, who had just pointed across the room and called a grown man the bad man. Then came the silence. It wasn't an ordinary hush, the kind that falls when a judge bangs the gavel or when a lawyer pauses for effect. This was something heavier. A silence that pressed on every chest, that made the walls seem closer, that left even the reporters' pens frozen midair. It was the silence of people collectively realizing they had witnessed something extraordinary, something raw and unfiltered. Juror number 4, a middle-aged librarian named Helen Briggs, found herself gripping her notepad so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had read countless books about memory and perception, but nothing had prepared her for the unwavering certainty in that child's voice. She could still see Emily's little finger pointing, still hear those 2 words echoing in her mind. At the far end of the jury box, juror number 7, a retired machinist named Walter Hines, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who didn't let emotions sway him. But as he looked at Harris, the accused sitting rigid at the defense table, Walter felt an unease he couldn't shake. The way Harris avoided the child's gaze unsettled him more than the footprints or the alibi ever had. Judge Whitmore finally cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I remind you again, this is not sworn testimony. You must weigh it carefully and not allow emotion to overshadow evidence. His voice carried authority, but even he knew his words were like pebbles thrown against a tidal wave. Across the aisle, Claire Morton, the prosecutor, forced herself to remain composed. She kept her hands folded, her face neutral. But inside, her heart pounded. She had gambled everything on this moment, and the silence that followed told her it had paid off. She didn't need applause or exclamations. The quiet said it all. The jury was shaken, and no amount of cautionary instruction from the judge could erase what they had just experienced. Mark Jennings, the defense attorney, felt the silence in a different way. To him, it was suffocating, damning. He glanced at his client, Daniel Harris, whose jaw twitched as though he might explode. Jennings leaned close, whispering harshly, "Do not react. Do not show anger. They're already looking for guilt in your face." But Harris couldn't hide his agitation. His fists clenched against the table, his shoulders rigid. He refused to look at Emily, refused to even acknowledge the child who had just branded him with 2 words in front of the entire town. His silence wasn't protective, was condemning. In the gallery, Rosa Ramirez hugged her daughter tightly. Emily, oblivious to the storm she had created, rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her rabbit clutched in one hand. To Rosa, the silence felt both terrifying and liberating. For weeks, she had lived with doubt, wondering if people would dismiss Emily's words as childish nonsense. But now, the entire courtroom had seen it. Her daughter wasn't confused, wasn't coached, she was clear. When the judge finally called for recess, the spell of silence broke, replaced by a wave of whispers. Reporters scrambled toward the hallway to phone in their stories. The gallery erupted in hushed conversations. "Did you hear her? Plain as day? I swear I've got chills." She didn't hesitate, not even once. But the jurors left quietly, their faces solemn. They weren't supposed to discuss the case outside deliberations, but they didn't need to speak aloud. Each carried the same image in their minds. A little girl pointing at a man she had no reason to fear, unless she knew something no one else did. Outside the courthouse, the silence rippled through town like a stone dropped into a still pond. By evening, Meadowbrook's coffee shops and grocery aisles buzzed with retellings of the scene. She just looked at him and said it. People whispered, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Even those who hadn't been in the courtroom spoke of it with the certainty of first-hand witnesses. The stories spread like folklore, growing stronger with each telling. Inside the prosecutor's office, Claire Morton sat at her desk, staring at her notes. She should have felt victorious, but the silence that followed Emily's words lingered. In her mind, it wasn't just silence, it was expectation. Now the jury would demand more. More evidence, more clarity. Emily had given them conviction, but it was up to Morton to back it with facts. Otherwise, the defense would tear her case apart for leaning on a toddler's voice. Meanwhile, Jennings spent the recess pacing in the defense room. "We've got to dismantle this," he muttered to Harris. "Jurors are human. They'll remember her face every time they look at you. I'll argue suggestibility, coaching, the unreliability of child memory. But you," he jabbed a finger at Harris, "you have to look calm, innocent. Right now, you look like you want to strangle the jury." Harris sneered. "That brat doesn't know what she saw. I was never in that house." Jennings rubbed his temples. "Doesn't matter. She believes she saw you. And belief in a courtroom can be as dangerous as fact." Back at the Ramirez home, Rosa sat Emily on the couch after the long day. She tried not to cry as she brushed her daughter's hair back. "You were so brave today, Mie Amor. Do you know that?" Emily looked up at her mother, wide-eyed and innocent. "Did I help the dog?" she asked. "The dog?" Rosa blinked. Emily nodded. The dog wanted everyone to know. I helped. Rosa's heart clenched. To Emily, it wasn't about courts or verdicts. It was about truth, simple and unclouded. And in that truth, she found comfort. But for everyone else, the jury, the judge, the lawyers, the silence that followed Emily's words was anything but comforting. It was haunting. It was unforgettable. And it was shaping the outcome of a trial where every fact suddenly felt secondary to the memory of a child's voice. As the sun set over Meadowbrook that night, one thing was certain: the silence after. Emily's words was louder than any argument the lawyers could make. And in that silence, the fate of Daniel Harris had already begun to tilt. The trial of Daniel Harris had always been fragile, balanced like a scale with too little weight on either side. Before Emily Ramirez spoke, the defense had reason to believe it could tip the scales toward acquittal. The evidence was circumstantial muddy. Footprints that could have belonged to anyone, an inconsistent timeline, and Harris's criminal record, which Jennings argued unfairly prejudiced him in the eyes of police. But after Emily's two words, "bad man," the balance shifted. Not with the clang of a heavy weight, but with the quiet certainty of a child's voice. What followed was not just a change in momentum. It was a transformation of the entire atmosphere surrounding the trial. Inside the courtroom, jurors sat differently after that moment. Their postures stiffened. Their eyes lingered longer on Harris when he entered. They leaned in more attentively during testimony, as if searching for confirmation of what they had already seen in Emily's certainty. Even though Judge Whitmore repeated his warnings that her words were not evidence, the human mind did not so easily discard what the heart had absorbed. Claire Morton, the prosecutor, felt the tide turning, but knew better than to relax. The silence after Emily's declaration had cracked open a door, but she still had to walk the jury through it with facts. She doubled down on forensic details, bringing in experts to confirm the footprint size matched Harris's boots. She revisited the inconsistencies in his alibi, pushing harder on the moments where his story didn't line up with phone records. Most importantly, she leaned into Emily's consistency, not as evidence, but as context. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said during one session, her tone steady, "you've seen a child, uncoached and unafraid, point to the defendant and call him the bad man. Ask yourselves, why would she say that? Why has she said it from the very night of the crime? You don't need her words to convict. You have the footprints. You have the timeline. But her voice is a reminder of who this crime affected most. An innocent child who had to see what none of us did." The jury shifted uneasily as she spoke. They weren't supposed to rely on Emily's words, but they couldn't help replaying them in their minds. Mark Jennings, the defense attorney, knew he had to neutralize the moment or risk losing the case entirely. His strategy became clear: dismantle Emily's credibility, not through cruelty, but through science. He called in a child psychologist, Dr. Karen Lively, who testified that children Emily's age were prone to suggestion and often repeated phrases without fully understanding them. Children at this stage, Dr. Lively explained, are sponges. They absorb language and ideas from the adults around them. It is entirely possible that Emily heard someone call the intruder a bad man and simply repeated it. Repetition is not memory. It's mimicry. Jennings hammered the point home during cross-examination of Rosa. "Mrs. Ramirez," he asked pointedly, "did you ever call the burglar a bad man in Emily's presence?" Rosa shook her head firmly. Not before she said it first. Those were her words. Jennings frowned but pressed on. "And yet, since then, you've repeated those words, haven't you? To the police, to neighbors, even here in court. Is it not possible that Emily is simply echoing the language she has heard you use over and over again?" Rosa's eyes filled with tears. You can believe what you want. But I know my daughter. She's not repeating me. She's remembering. The jury watched the exchange closely. Some scribbled notes, others stared at Rosa with sympathy. Jennings's argument was logical, even compelling, but it lacked the emotional force of Emily's moment on the stand. Outside the courtroom, the impact was even greater. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it far beyond Meadowbrook. Headlines like, "Toddler's two-word shake courtroom," and "3-year-old points to defendant in burglary trial" spread quickly. By the second week of trial, people from neighboring towns were driving in just to sit in the gallery. The media attention unsettled Harris. He had walked into court each day with a kind of arrogant defiance. But now, under the weight of staring eyes and whispered conversations, his confidence frayed. He snapped at Jennings, grumbled at reporters, and once even barked at a bailiff. Each outburst chipped away at the image of innocence Jennings desperately tried to maintain. Meanwhile, jurors felt the pressure too. Though they were forbidden from reading news reports, many admitted later that they felt the eyes of the entire town on them. The child's words had turned the trial into a spectacle, and they were the ones who would write its ending. Judge Whitmore did everything in his power to remind the courtroom of fairness. "You are not to treat the child's words as evidence," he repeated like a mantra. "You are to decide based only on facts." But even he knew the damage was irreversible. In chambers, he confided to a colleague, "You can't unring a bell. Once it's been struck, the sound carries." For the Ramirez family, the impact was complicated. They were grateful that Emily's words had strengthened the case, but they also worried about the burden it placed on her. Rosa shielded Emily from reporters, refusing interviews and declining requests for photographs. "She's 3 years old," Rosa reminded anyone who asked. "She's not a symbol. She's just a little girl." But symbols aren't chosen, they're made. And Emily had become one, whether Rosa liked it or not. As closing arguments loomed, both sides sharpened their narratives. For Morton, the case was about justice. A burglar who had terrorized a family, leaving a scar on a child who should never have had to carry it. "You don't need Emily's words to convict," she told the jury. "But they remind you of the truth. This man invaded a home where a child slept. And she, the smallest among us, recognized him for what he was." For Jennings, the case was about doubt, the unreliability of memory, the danger of being swayed by emotion. "Are we ready," he asked the jury, "to convict a man based on the words of a toddler who cannot tell the difference between truth and imagination? Is that justice? Or is that fear disguised as certainty?" The jury listened carefully to both. But when they returned to the deliberation room, the conversations always circled back to Emily. Her words weren't supposed to be evidence, but they had become the frame through which the jurors viewed everything else. Even when they examined the footprints, they asked themselves, would a child call him the bad man if it wasn't him? When they reviewed the timeline, they whispered, "She didn't hesitate. Not once." Jennings was right about one thing. Repetition is powerful. But in this case, the repetition was Emily's. Over and over, she had said the same thing since the night of the crime. And in the end, it was her consistency, not her age, that left the deepest mark on the jury's minds. By the time deliberations began, Daniel Harris's fate no longer rested on muddy footprints or phone records. It rested on 2 words from a child too young to understand their weight, yet strong enough to tilt the scales of justice. The jury room was heavy with silence when the deliberations began. 12 men and women sat around the long wooden table, the evidence spread before them like scattered pieces of a puzzle. For hours, they sifted through shoeprint photographs, phone records, testimony transcripts. Yet no matter where the conversation started, it always circled back to the same moment, the little girl pointing her finger and saying, "Bad man." She wasn't testifying. Juror number 9 reminded the others, his voice firm. The judge told us not to treat her words as evidence. Juror number 4 leaned forward, her eyes steady. I know what the judge said. But ask yourself why. Would a 3-year-old point at that man and say those words unless she remembered something? She hasn't changed her story once. Some nodded, others frowned. The debate turned over every angle: children's memories, the possibility of coaching, the weight of circumstantial evidence. Yet beneath it all, each juror felt the echo of the courtroom silence that had followed Emily's words. It was impossible to ignore. After 10 tense hours, the foreperson wrote 2 words on the verdict form: guilty. The next morning, the courtroom filled once again. The gallery was packed tighter than ever: neighbors, reporters, even strangers who had traveled. And just to witness the end, Rosa and Miguel Ramirez sat together, Emily at home with her aunt, shielded from the chaos. Rosa twisted her wedding ring nervously as she waited, her heart pounding. When the bailiff called for order, the jury filed in. Their faces revealed nothing, but the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. "Madam Foreperson," Judge Whitmore said, his tone solemn, "has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly as she held the paper. The clerk took the form, read it silently, then passed it to the judge. Whitmore scanned the words, then nodded gravely. "In the matter of the state versus Daniel Harris on the charge of burglary in the first degree, how do you find?" The foreperson's voice shook, but the words were clear. "We find the defendant guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a wave of whispers. Rosa clutched Miguel's hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. Across the aisle, Harris stiffened, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Jennings leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but Harris's eyes were locked on the jury, his jaw clenched so tight a vein pulsed at his temple. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel for order. "The defendant will be remanded into custody pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel echoed like finality itself. Harris was led away in handcuffs, his protests drowned out by the murmurs in the gallery. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to broadcast the news. Outside, cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, townspeople cheering or shaking their heads. But inside the Ramirez family's hearts, the verdict was not cause for celebration. It was relief, yes, but also a lingering sadness. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Rosa thought of Emily's small voice in the courtroom, the way she had carried a burden far too heavy for her age. Later that night, as the family sat around their kitchen table, the world outside buzzing with headlines, Rosa tucked Emily into bed. She stroked her daughter's hair, whispering, "It's over now, mi amor. The bad man can't hurt us anymore." Emily blinked sleepily. "The dog is happy now?" Rosa smiled through her tears. "Yes, the dog is happy. We all are." For Emily, the story ended simply. She had spoken the truth, and the grown-ups had listened. But for everyone else, the judge, the jury, the lawyers, the townspeople, the memory of her words lingered far beyond the trial. In the weeks that followed, the case became a touchstone in Meadowbrook. At coffee shops, people still spoke of the silence that had followed Emily's declaration. At church, neighbors prayed for her peace of mind. In classrooms, teachers reminded their students that truth could sometimes come from the smallest voices. Judge Whitmore, in a rare moment of candor, admitted to a colleague, "I've presided over hundreds of trials, but I'll never forget that little girl." It wasn't her words alone, it was the certainty. For all our rules and evidence, sometimes justice is illuminated by innocence. Claire Morton, the prosecutor, received letters from parents across the county, praising her for protecting the Ramirez family. Yet in quiet moments, she reflected on how close the case had come to collapsing without Emily. She knew the law was supposed to rest on evidence alone, but she also knew that sometimes human truth lived outside the rules. As for Jennings, the defense attorney, he walked away from the case haunted. He had fought with every tool the law provided, but he couldn't out-argue a child's conviction. In his office, he confided to a partner. It wasn't just the words. It was the silence afterward. The jury felt it. Hell, I felt it. There's no strategy for that. And Daniel Harris? His name was etched forever into Meadowbrook's history, not as a petty burglar, but as the man a toddler had called bad. In prison, he railed against the injustice, insisting the system had been swayed by a child's fantasy. But his protests fell flat against the weight of the story. People remembered Emily, not him. Years later, when Meadowbrook residents recalled the trial, they didn't talk about footprints or alibis. They spoke about the moment the courtroom froze, about the innocence of a child cutting through the complexity of law. They remembered the hush that fell, the collective breath held, the way two small words carried the weight of justice. Bad man? Simple, unpolished, unforgettable. For the Ramirez family, life slowly returned to normal. Miguel fixed the broken window the burglar had crawled through. Rosa planted flowers beneath it as if to seal the wound. Emily grew, her memory of the trial fading like the edges of a dream. But Rosa never forgot the sound of her daughter's voice in that courtroom. It was both heartbreaking and miraculous, a reminder that sometimes the truth comes not from experts or evidence, but from the unshakable clarity of a child who refuses to forget. And so, in the quiet town of Meadowbrook, the story lived on. Not as gossip, not as spectacle, but as a parable. That justice, in its purest form, is not always found in the weight of evidence, but in the courage to speak truth when no one else can.